22-year-old German nurse Greta Mueller clutched cyanide in her trembling hand. Certain American soldiers would torture her to death. Instead, they handed her chocolate, spectacles, and 3 hot meals a day. What happened instead shattered everything she knew about enemies, war, and human nature. And it's about to shatter everything you think you know too. Greta Mueller was 22 years old when Allied bombs shook her field hospital in 1945. Golden-haired, skilled with a scalpel, she'd saved more German lives than she could count. Now, as American voices echoed through the bunker, she prepared to die. Her commanding officer pressed a glass vial into her trembling hands. "Cyanide," he whispered. "Better death than what they'll do to you." The propaganda had been explicit, terrifying, and absolutely certain. American soldiers were monsters who took special pleasure in degrading German women. Every film, every pamphlet, every whispered story confirmed it. But here's what no one expected. When American GIs burst through that door, weapons raised, the first words weren't threats of violence. They were, "Medical help needed?" Wait, what? These supposed demons were asking a German nurse to help treat wounded civilians. German civilians. Where was the savage laughter? Where were the brutal hands? Where was the hell every propaganda film had promised? Something was very, very wrong with everything she'd been told. What happened next defies every war story you've ever been told. The journey to the POW camp should have been a nightmare. Cattle cars, beatings, starvation. That's what captured Germans expected. That's what their own forces had used on others. Instead, Greta found herself in a proper military transport truck, with bench seating. When it rained, American guards distributed waterproof ponchos. When the convoy stopped for meals, prisoners ate the same field rations as their captors. Think about this. While 27% of Allied prisoners died in German camps, only 4% of Germans died in American hands. The numbers don't lie. The guard sitting across from her was reading a letter from home, mechanically eating beans from the same C-ration can she'd been given. His name tag read Johnson R. And he looked barely 25. "Not the best food," he said in careful German, "but it fills the belly." When an older German woman collapsed from exhaustion, an American medic started an IV with the same care he'd show his own grandmother. Dehydration, he diagnosed. She needs the medical truck. Greta watched enemy hands work to save a German woman's life. This made no sense. Where was the hatred? Where was the revenge? That night, around a campfire, she heard American soldiers sharing photos of wives and children, talking about jobs back home, missing their mother's cooking. They weren't monsters. They were just people. Young, tired, homesick people. One soldier, barely 18, offered her coffee. "It's bitter," he warned, "but it's hot." As she tasted American coffee for the first time, one thought hammered in her mind. These are not the demons we were told about, but nothing could prepare her for what she found at the prison camp. Camp Clinton, Mississippi, materialized like a mirage from the humid southern heat. Greta pressed her face to the truck window, expecting machine gun towers and work gangs under whips. Instead, she saw German prisoners playing baseball against American guards. Their laughter carried across the compound. This wasn't a concentration camp. This looked like a military base. Processing was another shock. Instead of brutal interrogations, professional army nurses conducted medical exams. Instead of losing their belongings, prisoners got inventory sheets. Instead of becoming numbers, they kept their names. "Greta Mueller," she told the bored sergeant, who typed her information onto an official form. "Nurse, right? You'll like Lieutenant Anderson. Runs the infirmary. Speaks good German too." Barrack 7 was clean, well-lit, spacious. Each woman had her own bed with real sheets, a locker for personal items, and access to bathrooms with hot water. Hot water! She hadn't had a proper bath in months. Her bunkmate, Liesel, looked healthy, well-fed, almost relaxed. "You're wondering if this is real?" Liesel smiled. "I wondered too. Kept waiting for the nightmare to start. But it doesn't, Greta. They actually treat us well here." That first night, lying on clean sheets with a real pillow, Greta stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the camp. Guards talking quietly, someone playing harmonica, the gentle hum of generators. No screams, no violence, no torture chamber. This wasn't a prison. This was paradise behind barbed wire. But the real shock wasn't the comfort. It was what happened when she started working alongside her captors. Lieutenant Sarah Anderson was everything German propaganda said American military women weren't. Professional, compassionate, genuinely interested in German medical expertise. "I need experienced nurses," Anderson told her through a translator. We treat American soldiers, German POWs, and displaced civilians. Disease doesn't care about nationality. The work was voluntary but came with privileges. Better food, medical journals, the chance to learn new techniques. More importantly, it gave her purpose. Working with American medical staff revealed something profound. They treated German nurses as colleagues, not subordinates. When Greta suggested a different surgical technique, Dr. Mitchell actually listened, tried it, and publicly credited her when it worked. Good thinking, Muller. We'll add that to standard protocol. Where'd you learn that? The respect was genuine. He valued her expertise, treated her as a professional equal despite her prisoner status. The reality was even more impossible. American nurses shared their knowledge freely, taught techniques they'd learned from other prisoner nurses, treated German colleagues with warmth that went beyond professionalism. When Greta mentioned pediatric training, Captain Williams immediately put her in the children's ward. Children are children, Williams explained simply. They didn't start this war. The mess hall served 3 hot meals daily: real eggs, fresh bread, vegetables, meat. American guards ate the same food at adjacent tables, sometimes sharing jokes with German prisoners who spoke English. While Greta gained weight in American captivity, her family starved in Berlin, surviving on tree bark and sawdust bread. She'd been taught Americans were barbarians, but barbarians don't provide dental care to enemies. They don't learn prisoners' names or offer recreational reading. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared her for what happened at Christmas. December 1945. The war had ended months ago, but repatriation was slow. Many prisoners would spend Christmas in captivity. Instead of ignoring the holiday, Americans embraced it as reconciliation. The central hall was decorated with evergreens and handmade ornaments. American and German carols played from radios. The mess hall prepared traditional German holiday foods. What the Americans did next was unprecedented in military history. The camp organized an adoption program where American families could sponsor German prisoners, sending care packages and letters. Greta was paired with the Henderson family from Jackson, Mississippi, a Methodist minister, his wife, 2 daughters. Their first letter, written in careful German, brought tears. Dear Greta, we know you're far from home. We can't replace your family, but Christian love crosses all boundaries. We're praying for your safe return. The care package contained homemade cookies, warm socks, toiletries, vitamins, family photos. But it was the note from their 8-year-old daughter that broke her completely. Dear German lady, Mama says you help sick people like she does. Thank you for helping people even when they're not German. I hope you see your mama soon. Love, Susan. That night, Greta wrote to her mother in bombed-out Berlin. I know this sounds impossible, but I must tell you the truth. The Americans treat us with unexpected kindness. I work in their hospital. An American family has adopted me for Christmas. I don't understand this war anymore, Mama. If these are our enemies, what does that make us? That letter, like thousands of others, was read by military censors and sent to intelligence analysts. But for Greta, it was the beginning of a moral reckoning that would change her life. But the most devastating moment was still coming, when she saw the photographs that changed everything. The camp library became Greta's sanctuary. American newspapers provided an uncensored view of the war's end and something else. Photographs from liberated concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz. The images were devastating. Skeletal bodies piled like cordwood, survivors who looked like ghosts, American soldiers weeping at what they'd discovered. These camps bore German insignia, had been staffed by German personnel, operated with German efficiency. Many prisoners refused to believe the photos were real. Others wept, recognizing uniforms of units they'd known, sometimes faces of people they'd worked with. Greta studied the images with a medical professional's eye. These weren't propaganda. They were documentary evidence of industrial murder. Here's the devastating irony. Instead of using German knowledge of atrocities as justification for revenge, Americans organized educational programs to help prisoners understand what had been done while emphasizing individual responsibility and redemption. Dr. Abraham Goldstein, a Jewish-American psychiatrist, counseled traumatized German prisoners. Despite everything his people had suffered, he treated Germans with professional compassion. Collective guilt is poison, he told them. It paralyzes people. What matters is individual responsibility and the choice each person makes going forward. You can't undo what was done, but you can ensure it never happens again. Think about that. A Jewish doctor whose people were murdered by Germans, showing Germans the path to psychological recovery. But the most powerful part of this story isn't what happened in captivity. It's what happened when she went home. Spring 1946. After nearly a year in American captivity, repatriation finally came. The parting ceremonies were emotionally complex. American guards and German prisoners who'd worked together now faced permanent separation. Some exchanged addresses, others shared wordless embraces. Lieutenant Anderson gave Greta a leather medical journal. "You're a fine nurse and good person. Hope we can work together again in a world at peace." The Henderson family sent a final care package with an invitation to visit Mississippi someday. The journey back was as civilized as everything else. Clean ships, adequate food, medical care. But as they approached Hamburg, Greta saw her homeland's devastation. Hamburg was a moonscape of rubble. The harbor, once bustling with merchant ships, now hosted only Allied military vessels. Her city was gone, replaced by an archaeological site where people picked through ruins. Her family's apartment building was a pile of bricks. She found her mother in a basement shelter with 12 other families, surviving on American relief rations. The reunion was heartbreaking. Her mother, once plump and energetic, was gaunt and aged. Her father was missing. Her brother was in a Soviet prison camp, but even here the contrast jarred her consciousness. American occupation forces distributed food, medicine, supplies to German civilians. Their policies were firm but not vindictive. They were rebuilding, not just punishing. "They could let us starve," her mother whispered, sharing American beef stew. "After what we did, they could let us starve, but they feed us. I don't understand it." Neither did Greta. But she was beginning to understand something else, the kind of person she wanted to become. The story could end there, but the most powerful part is what happened next. How one woman's experience rippled across decades. The Germany Greta returned to wasn't just physically destroyed, but morally bankrupt. Former believers struggled with cognitive dissonance. Many retreated into denial. Others, like Greta, began the difficult work of reconstruction, both external and internal. She found work with medical relief organizations, treating refugees and displaced persons. The skills she'd learned alongside Americans proved invaluable. But it was the attitude she'd absorbed that made the biggest difference. She treated all patients equally regardless of background, shared resources fairly, refused petty nationalism, consulted with subordinates, listened to different viewpoints. These were distinctly American management styles. Letters from America continued arriving. The Henderson family sent updates on their daughters. Lieutenant Anderson shared medical research. Corporal Davis sent photos of his new baby. These relationships served as bridges between worlds, proof that the kindness had been genuine, not strategic. Years passed. Greta married Heinrich Weber, a fellow medical worker who shared her commitment to healing. They raised 3 children in West Germany, teaching them that enemies could become friends, that kindness was stronger than hatred. Her children grew up hearing stories about American captivity, not as tales of suffering, but as examples of unexpected grace. They learned that paradise could exist in unlikely places, that people could transcend their worst impulses. When the Marshall Plan began rebuilding Europe, Greta welcomed American aid not with resentment, but with gratitude born of personal experience. 8 years later, something impossible happened that proved some friendships transcend war. 8 years after the war, Greta received an unexpected letter. Camp Clinton was closing, but Lieutenant Anderson wanted to organize a reunion for medical staff who'd worked together. Would Greta consider coming to America as an honored guest of the U.S. Army Medical Corps? The journey back to Mississippi was surreal. The same landscape, but now she traveled as a guest, not a prisoner. Camp Clinton had been converted to a training facility, but Barracks 7 still stood. The reunion brought together American and German medical professionals who'd formed unlikely partnerships during war. They shared memories, compared medical advances, marveled at friendships that survived the transition to peace. But the most meaningful moment came when Greta was asked to speak to young American military nurses about her experiences. Standing before women who wore the same uniform as Lieutenant Anderson, she tried to explain what American kindness had meant to a young German prisoner. "You showed me that enemies could choose to be healers. You proved that mercy wasn't weakness, but strength. You taught me that every patient deserves care, every person deserves dignity, and every human being has capacity for goodness, even in the darkest times." Her words were translated into several languages, distributed to military medical units worldwide, became part of curriculum at military medical schools. This story has one final twist that will change how you see everything. Decades later, as an elderly woman in peaceful, prosperous Germany, Greta still thought about the questions raised by her captivity. Why had enemies treated her with more kindness than her own officers? How had people raised to see Germans as monsters managed to recognize her humanity when her own countrymen failed to see humanity in others? She never found complete answers, but she passed the questions to children and grandchildren as sacred trust, the obligation to treat others with the same unexpected grace she'd received. The revolution had been quiet, personal, invisible to history books, but it was real. It lived in every letter promoting German-American friendship, every patient treated with dignity, every story about redemption, forgiveness, and human goodness in humanity's darkest hour. Most of all, it lived in the simple, radical idea that sustained her through decades of reconstruction. Every human life has irreducible worth. Enemies can become friends, and sometimes the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through compassion. Here's what this story really teaches us. The barbed wire that defined her captivity became a metaphor for something else. The thin boundary between enemy and friend, the fragile barrier separating war from peace, the delicate line dividing our worst impulses from our best possibilities. And sometimes, just sometimes, that line can be crossed by people brave enough to extend their hand to someone on the other side. Sometimes paradise isn't a place. Sometimes it's just being treated like you matter by people who have every reason to hate you. The story of German women in American captivity remained largely untold, overshadowed by larger narratives. But for those who lived it, the experience was transformational. A glimpse of what the world could become when people choose mercy over vengeance, dignity over domination, and healing over hatred. That choice is still available today. Share this story. Ask someone you disagree with about their perspective. That choice, to see the human in your enemy, is still available today. What will you choose? German POW expected starvation, got Christmas feast. Instead, December 24th, 1945, a German soldier sat in an American prison camp, clutching a piece of paper he couldn't believe was real. It was a Christmas dinner menu: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, apple pie. He'd been told Americans would starve him to death. Instead, they were serving him a feast better than anything he'd eaten in years of war. This is the story of the Christmas miracle that changed everything German prisoners believed about their enemies. And it might change everything you believe about human nature. Klaus Richter was 24 when American forces captured him during the final collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945. A Wehrmacht corporal from Munich, he'd spent 4 years fighting across Europe, surviving on black bread, watery soup, and whatever scraps the German army could provide. As the Americans marched him toward the prisoner transport, one thought dominated his mind: at least the suffering will end quickly. German propaganda had been crystal clear about American treatment of prisoners. They were savages who delighted in German suffering. Captured soldiers would be worked to death in labor camps, fed starvation rations, beaten for entertainment. The lucky ones would die within weeks. Here's the brutal reality they expected. While 1% of German prisoners died in American custody, 27% of Allied prisoners had died in German camps. But Klaus didn't know these numbers yet. He only knew the lies he'd been fed. "Remember your training," whispered Johann Weber, a sergeant from Hamburg captured alongside him. "Tell them nothing. Expect nothing. They will try to break us with hunger first." But the first shock came immediately. The transport train wasn't cattle cars. It was passenger coaches. When Klaus asked for water, an American guard didn't just provide it. He offered him a cigarette too. This must be psychological warfare, Klaus thought. Make us comfortable before the real torture begins. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the deception seemed to continue. Clean barracks with real beds, mess halls serving actual portions of food, medical facilities where German prisoners received treatment for wounds and illnesses. "It's a trap," Johann insisted. "They're fattening us up for something worse." But days turned into weeks, and the worse never came. Instead, something impossible began to happen. Klaus was gaining weight. His wounds were healing. He was sleeping on clean sheets and eating 3 meals a day. But nothing could have prepared him for what the Americans planned for Christmas. December 20th, 1945, Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Klaus was working in the camp kitchen, voluntary work that earned him extra cigarettes, when he witnessed something that defied everything he'd been taught about his captors. American cooks were preparing massive quantities of food, not the usual beans and bread, but real food: turkeys, hams, sacks of potatoes. crates of apples, cases of milk and cream. "What's all this for?" he asked in broken English. The head cook, Sergeant Murphy, looked at him like he'd asked the most obvious question in the world. Christmas dinner, of course. For everyone. Everyone? Prisoners, guards, everyone. "It's Christmas, son." Klaus stared at him. In the German army, prisoners got whatever scraps remained after the guards had eaten. Often that meant nothing at all. Why would captors share their holiday feast with enemies? But Sergeant Murphy was already explaining the menu, like he was planning a family gathering. Roast turkey with stuffing, honey-glazed ham, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, cranberry sauce, rolls with butter, and apple pie for dessert. Real coffee, not ersatz. Milk, even ice cream. "Ice cream?" Klaus repeated the English words carefully. "3 flavors," Murphy grinned. "Vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry." "When's the last time you had ice cream?" Klaus couldn't remember. Most German soldiers hadn't tasted real coffee in years. Butter was a luxury reserved for officers. And meat? Actual meat was so rare that soldiers would fight over scraps of gristle. That night, Klaus lay on his bunk, trying to process what he'd witnessed. Around him, other German prisoners whispered in the darkness. "They're planning something terrible. This kindness cannot be real. Maybe they want us to write propaganda letters home. Or maybe they're trying to convert us to their cause." But Klaus had seen Sergeant Murphy's face when he talked about Christmas dinner. There was no deception there, no calculation. Just genuine excitement about sharing a holiday meal with everyone under his care, including his enemies. When December 24th arrived, what these German soldiers discovered would shatter their understanding of human nature itself. Christmas evening, 1945, 6 p.m. The mess hall had been transformed into something Klaus had never seen in 4 years of military service. Evergreen branches decorated the walls. Handmade ornaments, crafted by both American guards and German prisoners during recreation time, hung from the ceiling. A large Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights reflecting off the windows like stars. Klaus entered the hall with 800 other German prisoners, still half convinced this was psychological warfare. They would be shown the feast, then given bread and water while Americans ate in front of them. Instead, American guards began serving them plates piled high with food. Real plates. Not metal trays or tin cups, actual ceramic plates like they might use in a restaurant back home. Klaus stared at his plate in complete disbelief. A thick slice of roast turkey, the meat white and tender. A generous helping of stuffing that smelled like sage and onions. Mashed potatoes with a well of rich brown gravy. Green beans with slivered almonds. A warm dinner roll with a pat of real butter. Cranberry sauce that gleamed like rubies under the electric lights. Around him, 800 German prisoners sat frozen, afraid to eat, afraid this was a trap. "Gentlemen," announced the camp commander, Colonel Harrison, speaking through a German translator. "Tonight we celebrate the birth of Christ, who taught us to love our enemies and show mercy to all. You are our guests this evening. Please eat." Johann Weber, the skeptical sergeant from Hamburg, took the first careful bite of turkey. His eyes widened in shock. He chewed slowly, savoring flavors he'd forgotten existed. Then he began to eat with desperate hunger, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Es ist echt," he whispered in German. "Mein Gott, it's real." The dam broke. 800 German prisoners began eating the best meal they'd had in years, perhaps in their entire lives. The mess hall filled with sounds that hadn't been heard in months. Quiet moans of pleasure, tentative laughter, the clinking of real silverware on real plates. Klaus bit into his dinner roll and nearly wept. The bread was soft, white, made with real wheat flour. The butter was sweet and creamy. When had he last tasted butter? 1941, 1942. But what happened next proved this wasn't just about food. American guards sat down at the same tables as German prisoners. They ate the same food, shared the same conversations. Language barriers didn't matter. They communicated with gestures, smiles, shared photographs of families back home. Private Thompson, barely 19 years old, showed Klaus a picture of his girlfriend back in Ohio. Klaus showed him a worn photograph of his sister in Munich. Neither spoke the other's language fluently, but both understood the universal language of homesickness and hope. "Family?" Thompson asked in broken German, pointing at the photograph. "Ja, Schwester." "Sister," Klaus replied in broken English. Thompson nodded, smiled, and offered Klaus another piece of pie. At another table, Sergeant Murphy was teaching German prisoners to sing Silent Night in English, while they taught him the German version, Stille Nacht. The same melody, the same message of peace, sung by voices that had been shooting at each other just months before. But the miracle wasn't over, because what the Americans did next would prove this wasn't just holiday sentiment. After dinner, the prisoners received another impossible gift, paper and pencils to write letters home. Not censored propaganda letters. Real letters. Personal messages to their families in devastated Germany. Klaus stared at the blank paper, his mind reeling. How could he explain this to his mother? How could he describe a Christmas feast in an enemy prison camp that surpassed anything they'd ever shared at home? He began to write, "Dearest Mama, I know you will not believe what I am about to tell you, but I must write the truth. The Americans have given us a Christmas feast beyond imagination. Roast turkey, real butter, apple pie with ice cream. They ate beside us as friends, not captors. They sang Christmas carols with us. I do not understand this war anymore, Mama. If these are our enemies, what does that make us?" Around him, other prisoners wrote similar letters that would change the course of post-war history. "They treat us better than our own officers ever did. I have gained weight in captivity while you starve at home. How is this possible? The American guards wish us Merry Christmas and mean it." Johann Weber wrote to his wife in bombed-out Hamburg, "Liebling, I am ashamed to tell you that I am warm, well-fed and treated with dignity by our enemies. The Americans have shown me more kindness in one evening than I experienced in 4 years of German military service." These letters would later be read by German intelligence officers, who found themselves confronting testimonies that contradicted everything their propaganda claimed. These simple, personal accounts would do more damage to Nazi ideology than any bombing campaign. But the feast had set in motion something even more powerful, a transformation that would ripple through decades. December 25th, 1945, Christmas morning. Klaus woke expecting the previous night to have been a beautiful dream. Surely the usual breakfast of thin porridge and ersatz coffee would prove the feast had been his imagination. Instead, the mess hall served pancakes with real maple syrup, scrambled eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, and genuine coffee that smelled like paradise. "This cannot continue," Johann muttered, but he was eating with obvious pleasure. They will return to normal rations eventually, but normal never returned. The Christmas feast had marked a permanent change in how American POW camps operated. Not just in the food, though meals remained substantially better than German military rations, but in the entire philosophy of treatment. American guards now greeted German prisoners by name, not number. Medical care expanded beyond basic requirements. The camp library was stocked with German books alongside English ones. Education classes taught everything from English language to American agricultural techniques. Recreation programs included sports leagues where guards and prisoners competed as teammates. Most shocking of all, the work programs paid wages. Small amounts, but real money German prisoners could spend at the camp store or save for their eventual return home. Klaus found himself working in the camp vegetable garden, growing food that would feed both prisoners and guards. The American supervisor, Peterson, was a farmer from Iowa who taught him advanced techniques while sharing stories of peacetime America. "After the war," Peterson said one day, "you should come visit my farm. See how we grow corn in Iowa." The casual invitation stunned Klaus. This man genuinely wanted to maintain friendship after the war ended. He saw Klaus not as a permanent enemy, but as a temporary opponent who could become a friend. But the real test was coming, because when the truth about the war emerged, everything would be put in perspective. Spring 1946. As Germany's defeat became complete, American newspapers and radio broadcasts brought devastating news to Camp Shelby. The liberation of concentration camps. Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz. The prisoners were shown films and photographs that defied comprehension. Images of skeletal survivors, mass graves, industrial killing apparatus, operated with German efficiency and bureaucratic precision. The evidence was undeniable and overwhelming. These facilities bore German insignia, were staffed by German personnel, had operated under German command. While American guards were serving Christmas feasts to German prisoners, German guards had been systematically murdering millions of innocent people. Klaus stared at photographs of emaciated corpses being bulldozed into mass graves and felt his entire worldview collapse. These were the labor camps he'd heard whispered about but never investigated. These were the relocated populations he'd been told were being resettled in the East. The contrast was morally devastating. Americans had shown mercy to representatives of a regime that had shown no mercy to anyone. They had fed enemies whose countrymen had starved millions. They had treated as human beings people whose government had defined entire populations as subhuman. Why? Klaus wondered, staring at images of liberation that would haunt him forever. Why show kindness to us when we showed kindness to no one? The answer came from Colonel Harrison during a solemn camp assembly. Because mercy is not earned, it's given. Because Christmas teaches us that love can overcome hate. Because someone has to choose to break the cycle of violence, and we choose to be those people. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something that would reshape the post-war world. August 1946. More than a year after Germany's surrender, repatriation finally began in earnest. Klaus had spent over a year in American custody, working and learning and processing a transformation he still couldn't fully understand. When he finally boarded a ship back to Germany, he carried with him more than personal belongings. He carried memories of kindness from people who had every reason to hate him. He carried knowledge of what his country had done in his name. He carried questions about honor, mercy, and what it meant to be human. Germany was unrecognizable. Munich was rubble and refugees. His family's house was gone, his mother living in a basement shelter with a dozen other displaced persons. The proud Third Reich had become a wasteland of homeless, starving survivors. But even here, the contrasts continued. American occupation forces distributed food, medicine, and supplies to German civilians. Their policies were firm, but not vindictive. They were rebuilding rather than just punishing. Klaus found work with an American construction company, helping rebuild Munich. His supervisor was a U.S. Army engineer named Captain Williams, who treated him as a valued employee rather than a defeated enemy. "You were at Camp Shelby?" Williams asked when he learned Klaus's history. "Great place. I trained there before deployment. Colonel Harrison's a good man." The casual friendliness still amazed Klaus. These Americans held no grudges, harbored no desire for revenge. They seemed genuinely interested in helping Germany become a better country. But the most powerful part of this story was still to come, because what Klaus did with his experience would prove the lasting power of that Christmas feast. Klaus Richter didn't just return to Germany. He became one of its most influential voices for reconciliation and democratic reconstruction. He worked with American occupation authorities, helped establish democratic institutions, and became a bridge between two former enemy nations learning to trust each other. His fluent English and understanding of American culture made him invaluable in the delicate work of rebuilding German-American relations. When the Berlin airlift began in 1948, Klaus volunteered to help coordinate relief efforts. When NATO was established in 1949, he advocated for German membership. When the Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into European reconstruction, he helped ensure those funds were used effectively in Bavaria. His children grew up hearing stories not of American brutality, but of American generosity. They learned that former enemies could become trusted allies, that mercy was stronger than vengeance, that kindness could triumph over hatred. Klaus kept in touch with several American guards from Camp Shelby. Christmas cards were exchanged for decades. When Sergeant Murphy retired to Florida, Klaus and his wife visited him there. Two old men sharing memories of a Christmas that changed both their lives. "You know what I learned that night?" Murphy told him during that visit. "That feeding people is the most powerful weapon ever invented. Not because it makes them weak, but because it makes them human again." Other German prisoners who experienced similar American kindness became leaders in post-war reconstruction, politicians who supported Atlantic Partnership, businessmen who built trade relationships, educators who taught democratic values, journalists who promoted German-American friendship. The Christmas feast of 1945 had created a generation of Germans who saw America not as a former enemy, but as a partner in building a better world. But the most incredible part of this story is how it shaped the world we live in today. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, many East Germans who escaped to the West carried stories passed down from fathers and grandfathers about American kindness during the occupation years. When Germany reunified in 1990, strong German-American relations were built on foundations laid during those early post-war years. The Christmas feast Klaus experienced became part of a larger transformation in how civilized nations treat prisoners of war. Geneva Convention standards that seemed revolutionary in 1945 became international law. The idea that enemies deserve basic dignity spread around the world. American military doctrine still emphasizes humane treatment of prisoners not just as legal requirement, but as strategic advantage. Well-treated prisoners provide better intelligence, are more likely to surrender rather than fight to the death, and become ambassadors for American values when they return home. Klaus lived to be 89 years old, dying in 2006 in a prosperous, democratic Germany that was America's strongest European ally. His funeral was attended by both German officials and retired American military officers who had served in the occupation. His final letter, written to his grandchildren, contained this passage: "I learned on Christmas 1945 that enemies could choose to become friends over a shared meal. That lesson is still available to you today, in your own conflicts, your own divisions, your own choices about how you treat people who disagree with you. The Christmas feast at Camp Shelby proved that mercy is not weakness, but strength. That kindness can be more powerful than cruelty. That sometimes the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through compassion. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with dinner plates and Christmas carols, and the radical idea that every human being, even an enemy, deserves to be treated with dignity. The German prisoners at Camp Shelby learned that enemies could become friends over turkey and apple pie. That lesson is still available to us today, in our families, our communities, our world. The question isn't whether we have people we consider enemies. The question is whether we have the courage to invite them to dinner.